So it's recording now.
And I think that we've got the sort of surge of people coming in seems to have slowed, so I think it's okay to get started. I'm going to go through and start muting people who are not our official guests. And Dafydd, why don't you go ahead and start with the introductions?
Welcome everyone once again to Northshire Live, and I'm really, as I said, really excited about tonight. Wendy's publicist, as I said, wrote me, and I just couldn't resist. Wendy Williams is an award-winning journalist and science writer. She's published 7 books, including The Horse from a few years back, which was a New York Times bestseller and named one of the year's top 10 best nonfiction books by the Wall Street Journal. Her latest is The Language of Butterflies: How Thieves, Hoarders, Scientists, and Other Obsessives Unlock the Secrets of the World's Favorite Insect. And it's been called an informative and illuminating treatment of the accumulation of knowledge about butterflies through history. So it's the interesting connection between butterflies and people and how they relate. I'm really excited. Wendy is joined by award-winning nature writer Ted Williams, who's a longtime contributor to Audubon magazine. His book, Earth Almanac, A Year of Witnessing the Wild, From the Call of the Loon to the Journey of the Gray Whale, it's going to be coming out at the end of September. You're welcome to pre-order that online. Well, I put a link up there, or we'll get a link up there in a minute. It's a collection of short seasonal essays that document a year-long immersion in the fleeting moments of the natural world. Welcome, y'all. Welcome to Northshire Live.
I'm thrilled to be here.
All right, I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to y'all. Wendy, please tell us about The Language of Butterflies.
Well, I was actually just told today that the book has been named one of the hot summer reads by Kirkus Reviews, so that's nice news. It seemed like a kind of a funny book for me to be doing at first, an entire book about butterflies. I didn't expect to be doing that. I wanted to do a book about really good news stories in the world of conservation. And one story that caught my eye right away was the story about the Carner blue butterfly in Albany. That butterfly was almost extinct, and an effort to save it was underway, and along with an effort to preserve land in a pine barren that's quite like where I live. The pine barrens where I live on Cape Cod. So I started reading about it and thinking about it, and I went up there to visit the people that have created that wonderful place and learned about the Carner blue butterfly. And to be honest with you, it was like falling down the rabbit hole. I never thought that butterflies would be anywhere as interesting as they are. They're absolutely fascinating. And every time I started a new subject, it became a chapter, or it could have become a whole book in itself, but that would be too much. But I would read about a particular thing, like the proboscis that the butterfly has at the front of its body, and everyone talks about that as a drinking straw. But science recently has shown us that it's not a drinking straw at all. It's quite different. So I got very interested in the last 10 years of scientific research, what we're learning about all kinds of things based on scientific studies of butterflies.
I'll chime in. I thought I knew a lot about butterflies. I collected them when I was a kid, and I put them under glass. And Wendy's book, Marianne made the comment that really resonated with me. She said, "Dead butterflies seem meaningless." And after that, I photographed them. And I thought I knew a lot about butterflies until I read Wendy's book. And I was just blown away with it, the stuff I learned. She mentioned the drinking tubes. They don't suck up nectar.
It's more like a paper towel.
Yeah, it's more like a sponge.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea. And a lot of other people did. And I just, this morning, I read a great review, Kirkus, on Wendy's book. And just read it. It'll only take a couple minutes. A merry jaunt through the past, present, and future of butterfly pop science. In her hybrid history science travel text, science journalist Williams' previous book was a historical and scientific and cultural exploration of horses, leads readers through a body of human butterfly knowledge, driven by a guiding question. What is it about butterflies that so easily and so universally catches the fancy of Earth's Homo sapiens? In the first section, the author profiles early pioneers in butterfly breakthroughs. The second elaborates on the questions that contemporary science is currently trying to answer. The third section, urgent but not alarming, focuses on the environmental threats to the goddess of color and what we can do to ameliorate them, to keep the science and history accessible rather than overwhelming. Williams wisely selects key characters, transformational moments, and illustrative species. Most of the protagonists in her story are women, such as the inestimably brave German naturalist Maria Marian, 1647 to 1717, and an American mother-daughter butterfly tagging team. Readers should keep their computers or phone handy, as a reverent descriptions of the insect's beauty and may require visual satisfaction. Williams paces her animated storytelling skills, coupled with her orientation toward universal themes like nature of beauty, will appeal to the broad audience. The author views butterflies as emblematic of the natural world as a whole. The world's favorite insect unites us across generations and across space and across time. They are elemental. A butterfly is the entire universe right there in the palm of your hand, just as efforts to rescue endangered butterfly species have restored ecosystems. The innate human fascination with butterflies becomes a unifying factor in divided times. Our awe for them, Williams suggests, can motivate us to treat each other and the planet better, and the author guides us on our way as she informs, entertains, and rallies readers to the conservationist cause. That's one of the best reviews I've ever read about any book.
Wow. I listened to that and I think, wow, that author sounds really organized. She did a lot of thinking out. She really thought that book out a lot. Who wrote that book anyway?
Well, one of the things I learned is that the discovery of caterpillars, that caterpillars became butterflies, was only made in the 1600s by a very brave lady. Could you tell us about that, Wendy?
Wasn't that wild? And I'll tell you, I read that and then I thought, I explained to people that when I do my reading, I always have a pile of note cards beside me and I write sentences down and I write quotes down and words down. So I wrote a sentence or two down about that. And then later on, I went back to it and wrote, oh, I must be wrong about that. I must have misunderstood that idea. If I'm good, I've written down the source where I got it from. So I went and did more and more and more research. And yeah, the wild thing is in the 1600s, which isn't yesterday, but it's also not, it's also not 2,000 years ago. They didn't understand that specific caterpillars pupated into specific butterflies. To them, the world was just so helter-skelter. They really didn't understand that the world was a place of order and organization. It was just whimsical to them. Anything could happen. What did I say? Sometimes women could give birth to rabbits, they believed. Crazy, crazy stuff. So no, until Maria Sibylla Merian at the age of 13 came along to create a whole new science that we now call ecology, no one really understood that the natural world had order and organization to it. And I read a lot about it, and it's true. They didn't connect specific caterpillars with specific adult butterflies until at the age of 13, She was kind of like us today. We're not allowed to go out too many places. So she went out into her mother's garden and she began to study caterpillars really closely. What had just been invented was this brand new thing called a microscope, but it was a really primitive microscope. Maybe it was more like a magnifying glass, really, but she had one. Must not have been that expensive because she wasn't wealthy. And she spent all her time looking at these caterpillars. She turned out to be a fabulous artist because she'd been working in her father's publishing shop since the age of 5. She had to fill in with watercolors the different drawings of flowers that he made for his flower catalogs. So she was very talented, and she began sketching these caterpillars. And sketching with her microscope, she could look at all the little things that the caterpillars had on them. She was amazed, and she drew all of these. And then she discovered that these specific caterpillars she always saw on very specific plants. So she began drawing the caterpillars on the specific plants. And then she discovered that they made specific kind of leaf damage, that you could look at a leaf and see a particular kind of damage, and that would be from that caterpillar. And then she went on to draw the chrysalises that they created. And then she went on to draw in a routine sort of way the butterflies that came out of the chrysalises. So it was very phenomenal. She did this for 20 years. This was just her, it was what she did. And as I say in the book, research is nothing if you don't publish. So finally, at the age of 32, she went ahead and she published her own book. Remember, her father actually was a book publisher, so that helped. But since she was a girl, she wasn't allowed to go to school, but this is another weird thing. She wasn't allowed to use oil paints. She could use watercolors, but only males could have oil paints. What is that about? I don't know. And then she wasn't allowed to get any kind of education or publish anything. So she just said, well, I'll just publish my own book. And at the age of 32, she published all this art that she'd been creating for 20 years. And it ended up being a bestseller all over Europe. And she created the foundation for ecology by showing nature's net, that all of these things work together in this orderly kind of way, something that she found very beautiful, but something we could also depend on. How wild is that story?
Wendy, in her day, butterflies were worshipped, but caterpillars were reviled, called devil worms.
Yeah.
How did Maria evade being burned at the stake? I mean, 200 years later, one of Darwin's friends was jailed, I think, for communicating with the dead. Right. And somebody was burned for, several people were burned for claiming that planets rotated around the sun. Why?
Right.
How did Maria escape that? Why was she popular even then?
I think at first people saw her as an artist. She wasn't like Galileo writing down words that overturned the world order. She was just a girl, and she was just a girl artist. So she didn't say, here's what you need to know. I have a big nature manifesto. She just published her book of beautiful art. And like I say, it was in watercolors. She wasn't even insisting I'm going to do it in oil paint, and she wasn't allowed. And the art is so beautiful that people were astonished. And like I say, it became a bestseller. By that time, she had 2 daughters who helped her create the book. And these drawings were hand painted in those days. Of course, nobody, they didn't have, you couldn't print things in color. So the books would be created on a 1-by-1 basis. And then she and her daughters would actually paint in all the different colors by hand. So I think the books must have been very expensive, but they were so popular that people all over Europe bought them. I bet they would have been on the New York Times bestseller list. And what I loved is you can actually, some of these books still exist today. I went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York to see this book. It's a tiny, tiny little book compared to the second one, especially. It was a very small little book. It was just inoffensive. You know, she wasn't saying the church is wrong or anything like that. She didn't make the point directly. It was just there. Nature's Net was just there for everybody to look at. I don't know why she didn't get burned. She must have been just a very mild-mannered person or something. You know, well, eventually she left the Holy Roman Empire, and then she went to live in Amsterdam. And of course, Amsterdam was then what Amsterdam is today, a pretty free-thinking kind of place. So she ended up in the right place.
Wendy, you made the comment that butterflies are a gateway drug, and they certainly were for me. I got a huge charge out of the story of Herman Strecker and his obsessions. Just
Yes.
briefly run that one down for us.
Well, you know why? Do you want me to read? Because they wanted me to read a little bit from the book. Do you want me to read that?
That would be
passage?
great. That would be terrific.
It actually starts the book. And poor old Herman Strecker, he just really won my heart.
And I don't think he stole, people accused him of stealing butterflies, but that was never proven, correct?
No, it was never proven. They just didn't like him because this is after the Civil War in America. This is fast forward a couple of hundred years to the Victorian era in Europe and in America. And by then, butterfly collecting, you know, pinning and labeling dead butterflies was a really, really big thing all throughout European culture. Everybody did it, and they wanted to have the most number of pinned butterflies, yada, yada, yada. And so it was all a gentleman's hobby. And anybody could do it, but the people who wanted to amass these huge collections were people who could afford to pay other people to go to Southeast Asia and find giant butterflies for them. In the midst of all of this elite hobbyism, Herman Strecker became absolutely fascinated and enamored of butterflies. But he wasn't wealthy. He was a stone carver. He carved gravestones, and he didn't have very much money. But he had this passion, this complete addiction to collecting these butterflies. So that's how I started the book. And the first chapter is called The Gateway Drug. Herman Strecker was, by all accounts, a very odd man. He had a long face and a long neck and an even longer, out-of-control beard. He looked like Moses. He had deep, sunken, grief-filled eyes. He lived the unkempt life of a zealot, going so far as to crawl in between his bed sheets with his pants and boots on. By day, he was a poor stone carver who specialized in carving angels on children's gravestones. But by night, Strecker descended into a deeper, darker lust, a greedy compulsion that eventually dominated his entire existence. Some people want to possess money. Others want to possess clothes or cars or stamps or houses or politicians. Strecker wanted butterflies. Lepidoptera, that's Latin for butterflies and moths, lepidos being the Greek word for scale. He yearned to own at least one specimen of every butterfly species on Earth. He came close. By the time he died in 1901, having lived a life of intense emotional desperation, he had amassed 50,000 specimens. I can't imagine having 50,000 anything in my home. There must have been precious little room for anything else. I love Herman Strecker because he had a very difficult childhood. Later on in the book, I explain that his father used to beat him for all kinds of reasons. But somewhere in this miserable childhood, somewhere in this miserable youth and childhood, someone took him to Philadelphia, to a museum in Philadelphia, where these huge, beautiful, hand-painted books of butterflies, maybe he even got to see a book by Maria Sibylla Marion, were there, and he was allowed to spend all the time he wanted just turning page after page after page, looking at these butterflies. And in his eyes, in the eyes of this poor boy, this poor, sad, abused child, this was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his life. And that addiction started right then and there. And for the rest of his life, he pursued butterflies. So the story goes, the story that you were starting to tell a little bit, Ted, was he was so avid and so full of knowledge that he became very good at this hobby. He spent all of his money on it. He didn't make any money on it. He spent all of his money. I think his wife was not happy about that. But he was allowed to, because he knew so much, he was allowed to some extent to join this very elite world where people would write letters back and forth and trade butterflies. I have 3. It was kind of like trading baseball cards, and I have 3 of this one, but I want that one. And they would write letters and send butterfly specimens back and forth. But he just didn't have the manners, the upbringing, the style that people expected of that sort of, shall we say, gentleman. And he stepped on toes, and he was very blunt, you know, he was very outspoken and very opinionated. He was extremely opinionated. So he went to visit a lot of collections at museums and places like that. People began saying, he wore a stovetop hat like Abraham Lincoln. And people began to say that he wore that hat when he came to visit the museums because he had a secret compartment in the top of the hat, and that he would stash his coveted butterfly specimens that he wanted for himself in the top of that hat and take them home. So eventually no one would let him come to see their specimens anymore. And he was really, I would say, blackballed. He was blackballed from the whole shebang. But nobody's ever proved that. Of course, he said I did. He denied that he did it. And no one ever proved it. But it was enough, I think, for people to believe that he really did do it. He certainly, let me say, he certainly had the need. He certainly had the addictive need to own all the butterflies that he possibly could.
One theme in your book, Wendy, is butterflies are beautiful and they must be divine. Some people say, but not many people even now understand that there are some Lepidoptera that are vampires, some that bore through human eyelids and drink tears.
I thought that was a little shocking.
Right.
Not all butterflies are benign in our terms, how we would define benign.
And then, of course, the great story that you told about Vernon Wollaston, who ate up on Darwin, claiming that these butterflies are so beautiful. They couldn't have evolved. God had to have made them.
Oh, yeah.
That backfired big time on him. Tell us how.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. You know, I love writing about Charles Darwin, and I love writing about Charles Darwin like he's the guy next door. For some reason, I'm hooked on that. So, you know, that chapter starts off with Charles Darwin is sick with the flu, kind of timely, I guess. And everybody in the household is sick with some sort of flu. They're quite ill. And he had a huge number of children, and he had a huge number of servants. I don't know, what were there, 13 or 15 people in the household. Everybody was sick with the flu. And Darwin was also very depressed because people had been telling him that his understanding of evolution was wrong. And anyway, someone sent him in the mail a butterfly. What was this? Did they send no, someone sent him, he was writing a book about orchids. That's right. He was writing a book about orchids, which has a long, wonderful title that makes your eyes glaze over. And someone sent him an example of an orchid with a very, very long pendulum at the bottom of it. And by that time, Darwin had already discovered that butterfly proboscises had evolved to fit into the shape of some of these plants. So of some of the flowers. So he knew when he got this plant in the middle of his illness, that somewhere out there had to be a specific butterfly that had a proboscis that was long enough, a foot long, that could go in there and use the nectar at the bottom of that orchid. And I think he wrote in a letter, I was going to say email, he wrote in a letter, good heavens, what insect can suck it? And it took 100 years, but somebody did finally discover the butterfly that had evolved perfectly to fit into that orchid in Madagascar. So when Darwin first released his ideas about evolution, of course, some people thought they were fascinating, but many members of the church were not happy at all because it implied that God was not directing the whole show, or it didn't necessarily imply that, but that's what some people read into it, that God was not in control, it was some other force that they couldn't understand. And one of the most outspoken of these opponents was an Episcopalian bishop who wrote that Darwin was an idiot because nothing like a butterfly could ever have been accidentally created. God had to have created all the beautiful butterflies that existed on Earth. So Darwin was quite distressed about this, and he didn't really know very much about butterflies. He grew up in the Victorian era where butterflies were collected, but for some reason he collected beetles and not butterflies. So he didn't have much to say about that. But there were some fellows from England who were in South America at that time collecting butterflies for people who were paying them to do so back in England. And they saw this controversy going on. It was really a controversy in print by letters. And they wrote him a letter and said, hey, we have the solution to your problem here in South America. We are actually seeing real-time evolution, that we see a species of butterfly that flies here that is protected from predation because it's poisonous. Then we see another species of butterfly coming in, and after only a few generations, this new coming species, which isn't poisonous, has managed to change its coloration on its wings, change the color of its wing scales so that it looks more and more like the poisonous butterfly and can deter predators. So they were actually able to provide Darwin with evidence that showed that, in fact, the very butterflies that the bishop had cited as proving that evolution didn't exist were actually great examples of showing that evolution does happen. Not only does it happen, but sometimes it happens in real time and people can observe it and record the outcomes.
Wendy, you dedicated your book to our mutual friend, Lincoln Brower.
Yes.
And I knew him well. He helped me with some of my writing on butterflies. And he sent me those wonderful photos of a blue jay who had eaten a monarch and ingested the toxic digitalis that the monarch had gotten from the buckwheat and threw up. And
Yes.
Tell us about how he proved that by training monarch caterpillars to eat, was it cabbage? He trained
Yes. An incredible experiment. I never got a chance to meet Dr. Brower. I'm really sorry about that. We had a really, really good phone conversation when I was thinking about this particular question of evolution. And he helped me a lot with certain aspects of the book that I wanted to be sure I got right. And he sent me a lot of papers I needed to read, that sort of thing. We agreed that I would come down there in May to visit him, but sadly that was too late, so I did not get to meet him. For those of you who don't know, Lincoln Brower, I think it's fair to say that he led the effort for quite a while to protect monarch butterflies. And he died recently, I guess about a year ago. He was older and he had an illness and died. I'm sorry, I didn't get to meet him. But anyway, he wanted to show that that the butterflies were toxic. But maybe you could, I don't even remember this details of this, Ted. Do you remember the details?
Well, I hadn't realized until I read your book that he had trained caterpillars to eat something else. I think it was cabbage.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And it was very hard, and most of them died, but a few lived. And
Right.
blue jays ate those caterpillars, and they were just fine. So there was something that they were getting from the milkweed that was.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's now I remember. So yeah, this was a long time ago when people didn't believe necessarily that a specific caterpillar could ingest a poison and become toxic as a butterfly. So what you need to know about monarch butterflies is that the females lay eggs on milkweed and only on milkweed. They can't lay eggs on anything else. Then after a few days, 3 or 5 days, the caterpillar, the egg hatches and the caterpillar emerges, and then the caterpillar can only eat the milkweed. The thing about the milkweed is that it's very toxic, and quite a few of these caterpillars actually die just because of the milkweed. So at least half of the population is wiped out because they can't handle the poisons in the milkweed. But those who do handle the poisons survive, and they, pupate. They don't have to make their chrysalis on milkweed, by the way. And when they emerge as butterflies, they still have that toxicity in them from their time as a caterpillar. And what Dr. Brower was showing was that these toxins, which had translated throughout the whole life cycle into the adult butterfly, were the reason why animals did not predate on them. So first of all, he did an experiment and showed that the blue jays would try to eat a caterpillar, either a caterpillar or an adult butterfly, and they would get sick from it. It wouldn't kill them, but it would make them sick. And the cover of, was it Scientific American, where these wonderful photos of the blue jay getting sick and regurgitating and all of that stuff. So the idea was that the predator, whether it was a bird or whatever it was, would learn, I don't like the color orange. It would see the color orange and it was remember in its very specific biological way that it had gotten sick from that color orange, so it would avoid that color orange. Then Dr. Brower decided that what he wanted to do was create non-toxic butterflies. So he went back and began this experiment where he raised these caterpillars not on milkweed, but on cabbage leaves. And he didn't know if he could even do this. So he just raised many caterpillars and on the milk and fed them not milkweed, but fed them on cabbage leaves. And lo and behold, a very few of these did survive and did pupate and did become adult butterflies, but those were not toxic. So that's how he proved that the toxicity in milkweed was what was protecting the adult butterfly from being predated on. It sounds to us now like a very simple experiment, but back in the 1960s, it was groundbreaking.
It's a good example of mimicry monarchs. Tell us about that.
Are you talking about the viceroy?
Yeah.
Right. Well, the viceroys that fly near monarchs look very much, they look so much like monarchs that the average person looking at them isn't really sure right away whether it's a monarch or a viceroy. And that's true also with other predators. So if they see a viceroy, the viceroy automatically receives the protection that the monarch has created for it. So a bird looking for a butterfly or an insect to eat will not predate on a viceroy because it looks so similar to a monarch.
You can tell them by, they're a little smaller and they're a lot faster. And they have a
Are they faster?
Yeah, and they have a line on their both under wings, lined crosswise.
You're probably way better on species identification than I am. You know, I can barely, I was just out walking the other day looking for some, and I have to go with a butterfly guide because I'll see them and what was that? I can't even focus on them, but my butterfly guides always tell me, well, that's a blah, blah, blah. And I'm amazed that they can see that. It's hard to know all these different species.
Somebody else must have a few questions.
Yeah, I'd like to open it up for questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat. But before we get there, while y'all are thinking, I'd like to ask Ted if you could tell us a little bit about Earth Almanac that's coming out in September.
Well, it's I wrote there was a book written, published of my essays in Audubon. It was called Earth Almanac about 12 years ago. That was called Wild Moments. And that's like all the books I write. That was a rare book. And so I'm hoping this one won't be. It has those essays plus 50 more that weren't published. And we're hoping that that will do better. It was a really fun gig because I had been writing a column called Insight, which was feature-length article for each issue of Audubon that was really muckraking, and it was a bit depressing to get into this constant bad news. And this was kind of a recess for me to go and write these essays about what you can see in your backyard.
And I have actually been fortunate in that Ted sent me a finished copy of his book recently, and I read it, and the writing is absolutely fabulous. It's so delicate and so refined, and each sentence is a real treasure. It's like all these grains of sand that you can just, it's not a long book, but you have to savor each and every sentence and each and every idea. I just loved it. Ted, you're a fabulous writer.
I leave it in all the outhouses in Maine.
All the outhouses. Something to meditate on, huh?
Well, there's quickly read essays.
Yeah. Well, not so quickly if you're careful and pay attention to the sentences. There's a lot to think about in those essays.
Wendy, I'd love to kick off the questions if I may.
Okay.
We mentioned as we were getting started, you talked about the blue Carner butterfly, and when people were first arriving, I mentioned that my very first childhood activism was being out with a little sign that said, "Save the pine bush, save the blue Carner butterfly." I wonder if you could tell us how the blue Carner is doing today.
I love this story because it turns out that the Carner blue butterfly at Albany at the Pine Barrens is doing really well. I was going to be at the Carner Blue Lupine Festival, I think this coming weekend, but of course that's not happening now. But the numbers for the first 10 plus years, the numbers of this little butterfly were very, very limited. Let me back up first and explain to people who don't know what this is. This is a tiny, tiny little butterfly that is just very small and very delicate. It was loved by someone who a lot of us have heard of before, and his name's Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov was a real butterfly addict, every bit as much addicted as Herman Stresser or as Maria Sibylla Merian. He was actually a neuroaesthete in that he saw colors when he would read numbers and words. He would see colors in the words. I don't quite understand it, but color was a very rich part of his life, neurologically more so than for most of us. So he was fascinated also with color and with butterflies, which he had collected on his father's estate. He grew up in a very wealthy family in Russia before the revolution. So he used to go around and see butterflies in his estate and have his servants catch them for him because he loved them so much. Well, he left Russia, obviously, and had to come west and survived and came to America. And he was absolutely fascinated with this whole group of butterflies, which are these tiny, tiny little blue ones. They're all unique. They all do different, very strange and quirky things. Some of them trick ants into taking care of them. They're just astonishing. But he loved the Karner blue butterfly, and he'd never seen it before. He wanted to see this particular species of butterfly, and he could never find it because it only flies at very limited times during the year. So he had to be in the right place at the right time. One day he was driving from Boston to Cornell, where he was starting to teach, and he drove past this field. And as he drove past this field, a huge cloud of these butterflies rose up, and Nabokov, being Nabokov, couldn't help himself. He stopped and he went over and caught some of the butterflies. And so that became known as a place where you could find this much coveted, very beautiful little butterfly. Fast forward decades and decades, and Albany is expanding, and shopping centers are being built, and more pavement is being built. And this area where the butterfly was known to be living was slated for development. You could probably tell this part of the story better than I could. But anyway, a heroic effort, which you participated in, managed to preserve the land on which this butterfly lived. So everyone thought, fine, done and dusted, this butterfly is protected. But it wasn't. Its numbers continued to decline and continued to decline and continued to decline. And nobody who taking care of this land could figure out, what is it that's keeping this butterfly from thriving? We're doing everything we know how to do, and none of it is right. And finally, more than 5 years ago, but less than 10 years ago, Neil Gifford, who was the scientist there managing this effort, started to think about what happens on pine barrens when people aren't around. In other words, he went way back to before when people colonized that area. And he said, well, they burn all the time. You know, lightning strikes in the summer and the area is dry, and there's a lot of dead wood, and that means they burn. So Gifford decided that what might need to happen to bring back the Karner blue butterfly is to start on this land that had been preserved. Thank you very much, madam, for helping. This land that had been preserved maybe needed to be routinely burned in a very controlled and special way. Not so that you just let fires get out of control, because of course there are houses in all these places. So the people who own the houses would not be too excited about this. Instead of doing that, they started doing these really small, controlled, prescribed burns. And they found out that as soon as they did that, the Karner blue numbers started to jump astonishingly. There were more and more and more Karner blue butterflies there, because the key to the survival of this butterfly was burning the habitat in which the butterfly routinely lived. So the last I looked, 2 years ago, the numbers of the butterfly in this particular area, now the Karner blue is a butterfly that used to be spread all across from New England all the way out into the Midwest. They haven't had so much success in the Midwest with bringing this butterfly back. But in these areas where there are these small prescribed burns, they found that the numbers have risen to such healthy figures that they may not need to have the same kind of stringent protection listings that they once had. I love this story because I love success stories.
I think that's one reason the environmental movement is kind of floundering, because you don't tell the good news enough. There's a lot of good news.
Oh, there's a lot of good news. A lot of good.
And it needs to be published. That's one reason I loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
When I was a kid, we never saw loons, never saw eagles, never saw collated woodpeckers. And now our place in New Hampshire, he can't go outside.
We even have a bald eagle nest on Cape Cod now.
Right.
People are excited.
It looks like Margot, do you have a question?
Oh, I just wanted to chime in about the Cardinal blue butterfly, because some of you who are on this call might know that right here in the Saratoga area, we also have the same Saratoga Sand Plains ecosystem. And so the Cardinal blue butterfly is an important part of here in Saratoga County as well. Unfortunately, we do not do prescribed burning in the area at Wilton Wildlife Preserve and Park, where DEC is managing the butterflies. So they do the same kind of habitat management through mowing to keep the meadows open, so that there's the wild blue lupin, which the larval stage of the cardinal blue butterfly, that's what they have to eat, and the lupin requires the sunlight. So so they're famous around here too.
Well, I had a question for Wendy as well. I read your bio on your website, and you've had quite a full life of travels. Can you tell us a little bit about that and all the places you've been, and then also how that has brought you to writing about nature writing?
No, that's an interesting question, because I don't see myself as having a full life. I'm the kind of person that if I have to sit around for a week, it drives me crazy. You know, I've got to be going and doing things. And right now, you know, I feel like, speaking of addictions, I got to get on an airplane. I got to go somewhere. But of course I can't, you know, but I'd like to. So, yeah, I guess I was raised on National Geographics. You know, I grew up in a suburb of the city of Pittsburgh, and my mother had National Geographics on the bottom shelf of the bookshelf. And when I didn't have anything else to do, I just leafed through the pages, and I just wanted to be in all these places and see all these things. And my mother, who wasn't able, because of limitations on her generation of women, she wasn't able to live out these dreams. And she made sure that not only that I had these dreams, but then that I actually pursued them and lived them out. I lived for a long time in Vermont, where I was very happy. I had a horse, I taught piano, I had a very nice life. I lived in Putney, it was gorgeous. But it bothered my mother a lot that I was having such a nice, peaceful life. So she used to call me up and say, "What are you going to do with your life? Where are you going?" And finally, I said, "Fine, I'll join Peace Corps and go to Africa." And now normal mothers would say, "Oh, no, don't do that. Now stay where you are." She said, "That is great. When are you going?" So I don't know. I just love to travel. And I did join Peace Corps, and I did go to Africa. And it did change my life. It changed my life in a lot of ways. I got a very different perspective on life. I learned that some of the things that I took for granted weren't true. I remember walking into a very nice house in Dakar in Senegal in West Africa, owned by a friend. And I walked into the house, and I just had this odd feeling. It was a gorgeous house with nice furniture. What's wrong? Something here is unusual. Something is a little bit strange to me. And then I realized that in this house, there was not one book. There was not one piece of paper. There was not one pen. It was a whole huge house without any reading or writing implements at all. And I'll never forget that experience, because it never occurred to me you could have a house without books. I mean, what's the house for if not to take care of the books? So I learned an awful lot there about all the different ways that people live life. And I learned that these are just as valid as the kind of life that I was raised to live. So it made me open and interested in what people from other cultures all over the world are doing. I don't have to always agree with it, but I'm curious about it. I like to try to think about it. Why do people do this? Why do they think this way? Why is it done here in this way?
I'd love to chime in with a question. There are several folks here who I know are avid gardeners. And I've heard from my gardening guru, as I've been trying to learn a little bit, that gardening is the new sourdough of the pandemic. And I wondered if you had any advice on specifically butterfly-friendly gardening right now.
You know, the advice that I would have is that it's a whole lot easier than you think. First of all, we never really had grass at our house because we live on Cape Cod. And to have grass, you have to do a lot, and we're lazy. We didn't feel like all that stuff. I don't mow. It's a general principle of my life that I don't mow grass. So my husband has to mow the grass, and he doesn't really like to mow. But to have grass here, you have to just do a lot of stuff. You know, it's not normal. We basically, for those of you who don't know, Cape Cod is a sandbar, and I live on top of the sand and an upland part of that sandbar. It's 90-mile long sandbar, but it's a sandbar. There's no actual soil here. So if you want to do something like grow the kind of grass that you see in Kentucky, you need to work at it. And we just didn't feel like it. So planting flowers is and other kinds of things is a really good way to get out of having to take care of grass, which I've done from the beginning. I've lived in this, for someone who travels a lot, I've lived in this house for 30 years. I don't know how that happened, but I'm just too lazy to move, I guess. I don't know. But we just always planted plants, you know, flowers and things like that to take up the front yard. And a couple of years ago, even before I started doing the butterfly book, we decided to start to plant native plants and see what happened. And at first it was, oh, how do you do this? This is different and this is weird, you know. But of course, we don't really like new ideas on Cape Cod. If the Pilgrim Fathers didn't tell us in 1620 that we could do it, we don't want to do it. So there's nothing that Pilgrim Fathers told us about planting native flowers in front of our houses. But anyway, gradually we're figuring it out, even here on Cape Cod. And all you have to do is go down to most garden stores now, and they have a native plant section. They have a place where you can go to buy some of these plants that will attract butterflies. You need to be a little bit careful because you want to be sure that the native plants are organically raised and pesticides haven't been used on them. But we have finally done it. Last summer I was a little upset because we had to have something done with our septic system. So the whole front yard got plowed up and taken away. But this spring, because there's nothing else to do, partly my husband's been very diligent about replanting all of this. And it's just a wild thing to do. It's like, it's better than a soap opera. We have a porch and we sit on our porch, we sit on our little easy chairs on the porch. The drama that goes on out there, you would not believe. Bunny rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks, birds fighting with each other, all kinds of insects. The action never stops. So my advice would be do it because it's a lot more fun than taking care of grass, which is kind of boring anyway.
Well, this has been wonderful. Wendy, Ted, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. I think that's about wraps it up on the amount of time we've got. We appreciate it so much, y'all taking the time to join us today. And
it was lots of fun. Lots of fun. Hi, everybody.
Yes, this was fantastic. And if folks would like to unmute to say a quick hi and bye, that is just fine. This has been a lot of fun, and we will look forward to seeing folks tomorrow. We have a bookseller book chat at 5 where the booksellers from both Northshires will be recommending great books for summer reading. And then on Thursday, we have Rebecca Dinnerstein Knight for Hex Hall, I believe is the title of the book.
Hex, and she'll be in conversation with Marie-Hélène Bertina, who's presenting her new novel called Parakeet. Looks good. I don't remember too much about it right now, but Hex is great.
And we look forward to seeing you all again, if not at those, then at another Northshire Live soon.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
It was terrific.
Thank everybody. Thanks for coming. Next time we'll do it at my house with wine.
Okay.
Yes, we're all there. We're on our way.
All right. Okay.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ted. Are you still there? You there? Thank you, Ted. Those were great questions.
Good. Good luck with this. I hope this makes a big splash, Wendy.
Well, I hope so. It's a difficult time to be telling people about a book, but it's fun. Anyway, this is fun to do.
Maybe people have nothing to do but read, so maybe that's good.
Maybe. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.